Well, hello. I want to welcome everyone to Rural Resurgence Rebooted, a webinar where we're going to talk about migration trends that may or may not be happening out there. And want to give everyone an opportunity to just log in here. So we start at 1 o'clock. I'm going to give us just 2 more minutes. As I see, we're still gathering more audience, and this is a pretty heavily attended webinar, which is great. So I want to make sure that I have everyone logged in. All right. Well, let's go ahead and kick this off. So hope everyone's doing well. We're almost to the weekend. Here in Minnesota, we have a beautiful day. So looking forward to enjoying a little bit of the fall. And I hope everyone else is experiencing some good weather. I know many people, as part of this topic, who were working from home now. So one of the extra bonuses of remote work is being able to get outside and enjoy it. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Rural resurgence and remote workers. Many people, this topic's been up and talked about for a long time, but has gained a little bit more visibility in recent months. And so we're going to talk about 3 things here. We're going to try to look at 3 different areas. Are people fleeing urban areas and the coast for rural communities? We're going to take a look at that. If they are fleeing, who is fleeing? And what can communities do about this? So we're going to keep this pretty simple. We're going to talk a little bit about what migration we're seeing out there, what's happening, and how we can tap into that for our communities with our marketing efforts or our content. So I have a little picture here, date me just a little bit, but if you remember Marvin the Martian, and I remember vividly one of the cartoons where Marvin was taking over the earth and a bunch of Martian pills were dropped in the water, and Bugs was running away saying, "Folks, run for the hill." And so that brought to mind is, are people fleeing? Well, when we look at whether or not people are fleeing urban areas and the coast for rural communities, we can take a look at some of the top cities that have been experiencing migration over at least the last 4 or 5 years. And the data that I'm drawing from for this presentation is a little bit of the Census Bureau, but mostly from some of the LinkedIn worker economic development graphs. And the reason I use the LinkedIn reports is because it gives me a little bit more immediacy. The way LinkedIn, with their large network, tracks people is how they change their status. So if you change your employer status and that changes you from a community, it's a pretty accurate reflection of whether or not you're looking for a job, you have a job, you've changed a job, or you've moved. And so we'll be looking at some of those statistics, and this usually gives me, like I said, a little bit more immediacy on what it's currently happening, and then I compare that over the long haul to some of the labor and bureau statistics. But we're going to look at that. And before we jump into this, I'm going to ask you to take just a quick 3-question poll. And we're just going to see if we can gather the thoughts and sentiments out there. So I'm going to launch this poll. It's 3 questions. It shouldn't take you very long. And let's see what this comes up with. So I'm going to launch that right now. Hopefully on your screen, you should see 3 questions. And if you could just answer those for me quickly. Not a time test, so no big deal. And we're about 60% voted, so let's see if we can get that over 80%. Ideally 100, but I think some people are probably on just with an audio, so they may not have the screen. So 72%. Let's see if we can get over 80. We're at 75%. Wait for just a couple more. There we go, 80%, fantastic. Okay, let's go ahead and I'm gonna end the poll and let's just take a quick look at what the poll is. So I asked 3 simple questions. Have recent COVID unrest created a rural migration? So has the recent events that we've seen since February, has that created a situation where people are moving to the rural areas? I think the conversation is around that. There's plenty of news stories. There's lots of talk about that. The audience here is split between yes and maybe. 48% say yes, 48% say maybe, and we have 3% that says no. So we're going to look at that a little bit. Has your community experienced the migration? 41% said yes. 59% have said no. And then the last question, just do you have a plan to market to potential remote workers? 66% say yes, and 34% say no. So good. I think that's a nice snapshot of where we are. I think that's very consistent with many of the other conversations I've had. One of the things that I'll point out at the very onset here is when we talk about remote workers, some people have equated that to it's just a phenomenon that started in February with COVID, as everyone was pushed into their homes and working remotely over the Zoom interface or some type of telemeeting. Remote workers have actually been around for a long time, and you can even trace this all the way back to when Richard Florida released his book about the rise of the creative class. The remote workers are a little bit untethered, and they can get away with moving into their homes and doing things more freelance and so forth. So the remote workers themselves has been a population and a class that's been growing. And I would never want to suggest that the remote environment, the virtual environment was created by COVID. It was maybe moved forward with COVID, but I just try to remind people that remote and virtual has been around for a long time. In fact, our company is 100% virtual. We've been in the virtual environment with people spread out since our earliest days in 2009, and have found some very, very large advantages to that. So, but let's talk about now, is there data to support any type of migration? So if we look at the top cities experiencing positive migration, Austin, Nashville, Charlotte, and you can see the whole list. These are areas that have been seeing positive growth, and I've been watching them for some time. If, we want to see, has that migration stopped? Has it flattened? Has it dropped? Because many of these are areas that we would consider to be hotspots of some of the unrest. Certainly Seattle and Portland have made the news, Austin and Texas, Florida for the COVID. So there's a pretty good cross sample here of what might happen. So let's take a look at those communities. When we look at Charlotte, you can see that since January, Charlotte's continued to rise up and to the right. When we look at Tampa was moving along, but then in August, they had a large drop off of migration. Now, that's not saying that people are necessarily moving out. They're just not moving in as rapidly as they were. If you look at Nashville and Raleigh, though, these folks have dropped off precipitously. Nashville was kind of growing along very nicely there, but really they bottomed out. Then they rebounded a little bit in July and at a lower level. Now, Raleigh was a little bit of an anomaly, and I'm still looking into what happened in June. But for some reason, Raleigh was flat, dropped out in June, but then came right back. So that gives us a little bit of the East Coast down to the Florida Panhandle, and looking at what happened in the East. Let's move over to the Central or the Pacific area. Denver was very hot for a long time, but since January, they've been cooling off on migration. Dallas actually has come on. Dallas in the early part of the year and the end of 2019 was seeing very slow migration into them, but then in February, whether or not that coincides with COVID or not, they jumped up in the top 10 and they started to take off. When we look at Austin, Texas is very interesting. They were coming down, then they recovered a little bit in June, and then they've come back down. Whether or not the outbreaks in the Dallas area or the Texas area contributed to that too? It's hard to say, but those are the effects of the migration. Las Vegas has been very much up and down, and it's just hard to explain what could be accounting for Las Vegas. Let's look at Portland and Seattle, because I hear a lot of people talk about with the unrest that happened in those areas. Is that affecting them? Well, certainly Portland, just in a causation, maybe not a perfect correlation, we can see that they were moving along, but then in July, and this coincides a little bit with much of the unrest that happened on the West Coast, they certainly dropped off. Not hardly any migration. I mean, that migration has just really, really slowed down. We'll see what that's going to look like for the rest of the year. Seattle also was rising up through June, and then at least anecdotally, it looks like they were feeling some of the after effects as well of what was happening on the West Coast. All of this points to the fact that our migration data is still pretty inconclusive. All the studies that I've read, everything I've looked at, I think it's very hard to actually say that there's this mass exodus. In fact, one of the things that is continuing to account for most of the movements, and this certainly would apply to LinkedIn, is the jobless, the loss of jobs. And if you look at the red line, that's this year versus last year in the hiring, and you can see certainly coming out of March and into the end of June, the jobs loss rate just increased. Many people lost their jobs, which of course accounts for a lot of the migration patterns as well. People are going to move to where there's jobs, they're going to move away from jobs, and so forth. And so the data that we're seeing and that I've looked at, certainly the jobs is a bigger factor on the migration than maybe the unrest and the COVID. So where are people coming from? Well, the interesting thing is we might expect if there is a big rural resurgence because of the unrest that they might be moving inward. And what we still see, and I've seen these for at least 8 months, is places like Tuscaloosa, Wichita, Kansas, Lincoln, Nebraska are still places that people are migrating from. These are areas that people are leaving, and it has more to do with the lack of or the loss of opportunity, or maybe the movement to go to better jobs and better paying opportunities. So I don't necessarily see a big movement into the communities that you might expect. So there still is a migration on its way out. Let's look at some of the factors that we need to consider. And I bring this up because the COVID situation or the unrest, while they're big news items, they're probably not big enough events to actually move the population to make a big effect. In fact, the biggest, still one of the biggest things that affects population is the natural change, and that is birth versus deaths. And we continue to see that since 2010, non-metro population has a difference of birth rates. And so as long as the birth rate goes up, which is what we really want in our rural and non-metro areas, that's going to be the biggest long-term gain of population. We have seen migration since 2010. 512,000 people have moved out of non-metro areas. So we still see people moving out of the non-metro areas into metro areas. Now, a large part of that is a reclassification of metro and non-metro areas. So when we actually break those numbers down, one of the things that we found is people that are on the outer circles of a metro area that are in a non-metro area, if there's an annexation or if there's an expansion, they're just immediately reclassified. So that accounts for some of that 512,000. It'll be interesting to see what our new census data shows us. But the biggest thing that I want to remind people, and the reason we do this and we talk about it with our clients, is because I'm sure many board members are asking and they're reading the news, or city council members saying, hey, I hear about this big boom of people moving around. And there certainly is something to that, but it's not like there's the big migration waves that are sweeping across the country. So we need to be able to temper expectations and let boards and city councils, elected officials know, hey, there's still other things going on that we need to pay attention to. Net migration rates, again, are affected mostly by babies and birth rates. We saw that in the net out migration was actually most severe during the 1980s compared with 2010 to 2017. But overall population remained positive because of a natural increase. So again, the natural cycle of human being, births and deaths, just can't emphasize that enough. That means a lot in migration, and we should remember that. Non-metro net migration rates peaked during the rural rebound, which really happened in the mid-1990s. So hopefully we'll see that a little bit in the 90s. What happened in the 90s, we'll see that a little bit coming up with the new census. But there's some things that point to a rural rebound and it points to a rural resurgence. But we want to make sure we understand what factors are contributing to that and that they're just not a flash in the pan. One of the things that I remind people is the Great Recession of 2008 is still out there and lingering. When we look at all the numbers, and the interesting thing is, while the jobs had bounced back and we see the market had bounced back, the stock market, still that downturn in natural fewer births caused a lot of issues. In fact, one of the things, if many of us remember, that we were struggling with before COVID was we had an unemployment rate that was so incredibly low. And a lot of that was because the birth rate 20, 25 years ago was low, and therefore we weren't filling jobs fast enough. Now, COVID, it'll be interesting, is resetting the deck, so to speak. But I mean, I think lots of us remember not too long ago when the biggest part that we were struggling with for communities was how do we fill the jobs that are out there? We don't hear that anymore. Now, of course, we have a jobless rate, an unemployment rate somewhere in the 7.3 to 8% range, and we'll see how that resets. I think that we're going to, on the jobless rate, until we start to see the effects of retraining, it'll be interesting to see how that gets affected, because much of, as we know, much of the retail and hospitality jobs are just going to go away for a while until we figure out how the COVID comes back around. One thing that I did want to bring up, because many people should know this, or you should pay attention to this for your marketing as well as when you talk to boards and elected officials, but 90% of the coronavirus cases are still concentrated in the urban areas. That's been the case in the U.S. when you look at New York, Chicago, Boston, and so forth. So certainly, and it's not a big surprise, but I think we just have to remind ourselves that the urban area and the rural areas have two distinct attributes when it comes to spreading coronavirus. And I'm not trying to politicize this, don't want to pick sides one way or the other. However, we do know that density matters on infection rates. And certainly if you're in a less dense area, you can take different precautions than if you're in a more dense area. And for the purposes of our webinar, what is that going to mean? So let's look forward. So what does all this mean? I think that it would be fair to say that the answer that I would most align with on whether or not the recent events are contributing to migration, the answer, in my opinion, at this point would be maybe. Maybe people are moving. It's hard to tell. Moving is still a big endeavor with the social distancing. It still is hard to get around in some places. It's not necessarily as easy to just grab the U-Haul truck and move the family. So there are some different obstacles and constraints, but it's not a no, it's a maybe. And when I looked at this, and when we look at it from a communications and marketing, the thing that I want to know is, all right, if I can't decide, or if I can't quantitatively move or predict if people are moving, can I at least try to figure out what their intentions are? And that we can do with the wonderful world of search engines. So let's look at Google Trends and let's see what people are searching for. And the reason it's important to look at trends is when people are sitting at their homes, they will use Google or search engines to search for their aspirations of, like, what if I wanted to move? How would I start to search and get my mind ready for that? So I started to look at the Google trends to see what might be trending. And no surprise, rural real estate is trending very high. It's been trending since April. So whether or not people are actually moving, they're certainly looking at what it would take to get into a rural real estate transaction. What would it take to move myself or my family into a rural area? And this is pretty pronounced when you look at from September 15th of 2019 to where it was kind of up and down. And again, this is just trends. Are people searching for this? You can see that people are going up and down, probably more weather related. But then in April, which our event of COVID is right here, and then we get into May, which is the unrest. You see that at least in the search engines, people are searching and wondering what opportunities exist in rural real estate. So I took this a step further. I looked at some other search terms and I thought, well, let's see what else they may be searching. Farms for sale continues to rise. This is quite interesting. It went from just a very line to a jump up in April where suddenly people are looking at farms. They might be looking at a hobby farm. They might be looking at something that's a little bit more self-sustaining. I don't know if many people know this, but there is a huge shortage in this country right now for canning jars and lids because of this reason here. People with the COVID were home. They were growing bigger gardens or maybe a new garden. And about 4.5 weeks ago, and our family certainly saw this. We're big gardeners and we like to can, but the cans and lids were just gone off the market. And then the prices for them was very high. So certainly people are looking at something. They're looking at aspirations, opportunities. And one of those is, what does the rural opportunity give to us? So if we know that people could migrate, and with broadband and other opportunities, we know that people have the ability to it. And if we look at the Google trends and we know that they're looking at it, that creates an opportunity for us as communities in the marketing space and the economic development, because we want to capture their attention. If we know what they're looking for, we know what's trending, we can start to create content that hopefully will grab their attention. And that's what this is all about, getting eyeballs to your community. So when I look at on a monthly basis, if we were to help a community, and when we help them with their rural and their remote worker strategy, we look at all the different search terms that we could be using to make relevant content and to attract attention. When you look at the top search terms on a monthly basis right now, notice rural real estate is out there, rural Idaho, rural real estate. So you could apply this formula to your state, rural real estate. And remember, there was 950 searches last month on rural real estate. Maybe 50 of those will apply to your area, or maybe 50 of those will apply to your state. But you still want to try to capture those 50. You're not going after the 950. You're going after the subset that will be in your area. How do you do that? Well, people use search questions now. They don't necessarily just type in search terms. They're going to type in questions. So what's the most affordable real estate areas? You can see there was 55 searches for that. What expenses are in a rural real estate deal? As you keep looking down here, each of these, and here is one of the secrets that I'll share with you today, each of these is a nice piece of content that you could write for your community. So you might be able to write, let's say I'm in a central town here in Minnesota. If I was to put a piece of content together, which we have, one of the things I would do is, what type of loans can I get in Little Falls, Minnesota for real estate? some variation of one of these top questions. That way, when somebody searches for a question of what type of loans can I get in rural area real estate, my search engine or my search term, my question, and my content will be relevant. And that's how we start to grab traffic. So once we know, if you could imagine a river of people searching, we're just going to tap into that river of search terms and questions and try to pull people out of the river to the bank to say, hey, read about our community. So here's every one of these questions here, you could probably put into your community. For example, how to find rural real estate in your community. Who is buying real estate in your community? You can do lots of variations of this. And if you have a very good article that's written and that people enjoy, they'll share it, that becomes viral, and it helps drive up your search engine optimization. So let's talk a little bit more. What else could you do? Well, here's some other keywords that are out there. Last month, 10,400 people searched for farms for sale near me. This is a great one. I recommend this to communities all the time, and that is you should grab the search term farms near me and put your town in, and then write articles about that. A lot of people just put real estate listings out there. Actually put those into an article and write the content. Because if you remember, from a search engine standpoint, the search engine's trying to do one thing, and that is answer the user's question as close as possible. So if you can write a piece of content and answer that user's question, you will have a higher percentage of viewership on that article. And you can take all of these terms, and we've mined these, we've been out looking at them to see what's all out there. You can take any of these terms and you can apply those to your area. So Nebraska ranches for sale. I'm sure you have ranches in your area, or Missouri farms. Turn these into content, turn these into articles that you would release on your Facebook, your other social media, as well as your website. The next thing you want to do is look at what are the top trending employers and how can you tap into the migration of those workers. Right now, Amazon is really one of the big employers. With all the remote going on, with everything that's happening, Amazon and Amazon Web Services continue to be the most high growth for recent hires. Microsoft, Facebook, Wells Fargo, you can see these are all companies that are offering remote worker opportunities. So use that to your advantage when you start writing your articles. You might write an article about ranches or real estate in your area that might be appealing to Amazon workers, Microsoft workers, Facebook workers. Write your content specific to this, because we know if we look at the search data, these are the terms they're searching for. These are some of the jobs they're looking for. So let's drill down one more level. Let's go into top trending jobs, not just employers. So right now, software engineers, project managers, account managers, salesperson, all the jobs that you would expect in a creative or remote working environment, these are the jobs that people are hiring for. So now let's build ourselves a little bit of a formula. I might take a topic like Texas rural real estate, if I'm in Texas, write a piece, an article about how to price rural real estate with acreage, or what type of loans can I get for rural real estate in Texas. So that's part of my content. Now I can write my article about how do Microsoft software engineers price real estate in rural Texas. Find variations of all these. Maybe the best way you could do this, find somebody in your community that is a software engineer, somebody that is a project manager. If you're lucky, maybe they work for one of those big companies, and then write a success story about, here's a person who's a software engineer working for this company who bought a rural piece of real estate or moved to a remote location. Tie it all together And then you have a formula for some really powerful content. And then you're going to start to capture those eyeballs of people looking to possibly move to rural areas, take advantage of remote locations. All right, so that's a mouthful. I'm going to take a break just for a second here. I want to make sure that I haven't missed any questions that are out there. And I don't see any questions. So, and feel free to throw some out there as I just catch my breath for just a second. And then I'm going to move into a couple of easy steps that you can do in your own community. Sorry, got the noon sun shining right on my face. So, okay. Top trending skills. One more thing that I want to add is so we can talk about jobs. We can talk about companies. We can talk about job skills, teaching, JavaScript, curriculum development. Again, make your articles relevant to these search terms because that will help you gain visibility and accessibility from people that are searching for those terms. And all of this will be available in this presentation sent out to anybody on this webinar, so you'll have access to all this. So what do you do with all this stuff? Well, and what I'm going to do here is give you just a real simple strategy, and then I'll stick around for some questions. But one of the first things I would do, I would recommend is go register a domain. They're very cheap, and register your town, your community remote if you can get it. So just go out there and get that domain so that you can start to build a page. Even if you don't get a chance to build the page right now, you want to park that domain so you have access to it. So your community with the word remote in it.com. Set some SMART goals. If you're not familiar with the SMART plan, just do a quick Google search. But SMART are obtainable goals that say, hey, what do we want to do that's specific? What do we want to do that's measurable? What do we want to attain? And then really hone in on those. So I want to create a landing page. I want to launch a content strategy over 6 months. I want to create 3 pieces of content articles that are shared. Put your goals in place so you can then put your content plan and site map together for what we would call a micro website or a landing page. Use the trending terms that we uncovered for you. Use the trending keywords. Use trending questions. Think about what questions you might ask yourself or you might search for if you were moving to a remote area. Then design a landing page. I'm going to show you an example of one here in a second. We work with Tulsa, Oklahoma, and this was the one they created. And then just launch your content in social media. So you don't have to make this, a 25-page strategy document and content plan. Just register a domain, set some goals for it, create a content plan with the existing search terms that we know people are already using, design a landing page, and then launch it. Let's look at what Tulsa did. Very simple. I want to make sure, I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to have to stop sharing, and then I'm going to share this one. Okay, this is Tulsa Remote. Notice they use the tulsaremote.com. And if you haven't seen this, this is a great one just to go out and look. They're offering some incentives. They're offering a whole package, and they put together a really nice landing page site that attracts remote workers. So now if they put the content, which they have, and they draw people here, then of course there's a strong call to action. And all of that works to bring in people to Tulsa Remote. At the end of the day, you hit the Apply Now button. You're going to submit your information. You're going to, if you're Tulsa, you're going to get that lead information, and you're going to be able to follow up with that person who submitted it. And that's really as simple as it is. I didn't want to overwhelm the group. I didn't want to throw a whole lot at you. I just wanted to show you that while we may not know if there's migration happening, people are certainly trying and looking at it. And our biggest goal should be, how do we capture their attention online? All right. So with that, Victor, are you getting any questions? I haven't seen any come through yet. I'm hoping it's not because I talk too fast.
Not yet.
Okay, so no questions yet. So with that, I promised about a 45-minute webinar. I'll stick around if there's any questions, but other than that, we'll be releasing this presentation after this within the next day or two, so people will have that if they'd like it. Feel free to share that with others that may not have been able to attend the webinar. Other than that, I just want to thank everyone. Really appreciated sharing, and I hope you found this useful. So one question that came in was, this works for single sites. Would it work for a region? Absolutely. We've actually helped a couple of regions, and if you can get all the communities in that region together, you can really leverage what they all have. So absolutely, it works really well for regions. I appreciate some of the comments that are coming in. I'm glad that you found this to be enlightening and that there was an easy approach for using this for your community. So hopefully everyone has an opportunity to leverage something here. All right. Well, again, I'm going to thank everyone. I really appreciate the comments. And we're going to end the webinar, and then we'll send this out with a follow-up email. So thanks for attending today.